scripture, and they called me up yesterday morning. I was getting ready to come up to clean the church. And Billy got a text saying, I'd be able to do the scripture reading. So I don't mind doing it. So I said, yeah, Billy, tell him yes. So I guess he must have texted him back and said, I'll be here. Well, I got up here to expect the cleaning, and downstairs they all set up for the Sunday school lesson. I looked on the board there, and here my name is already written down. I guess I couldn't get out of this. I'm reading from Proverbs, chapter 16, verses, I believe it's 16 to 20. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather than get chosen than silver? The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He that keepeth his way preserveth his soul. Pride goes before destruction. That's good. And a haughty spirit before a fall. Better it is to be an humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. And he that heareth a matter wisely shall find good. And who trusteth in the Lord, happy is he. Thank you, and may the Lord add his blessing upon these, his holy word, and I shall descend over my
Turn with me, please, in your Bibles to the book of Esther. Esther chapter 1, the study today will center in verses 10, 11, and 12. The title of my message is A Drunk and Angry King. Esther 1, 10 through 12. If you were not here last week, it would be helpful after I read the scripture to give a little bit of an introduction. I hope that you are enjoying our studies in this tremendous book. Esther was a powerful woman of faith and courage, or as Chuck Swindoll says, dignity and strength. She was a star in God's Word, how she stood up for her people, the Jews, and saved them from extermination. Esther chapter 1, I'll begin reading at verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king, notice, was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was, notice, beautiful to behold. That's what the name Vashti means, beautiful woman, as J. Sidva Baxter points out. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. The book of Esther is a powerful book. It's found, if you find the book of Psalms, if you don't know where the book is, take a left-hand turn, you'll be there in a couple of books, okay? It's an easy way to find the book of Esther. There's only 167 verses in the book. You can read it in 32 minutes. I think that's Woodrow Kroll's estimate, Woodrow Kroll. I don't know how they come up with 32. Why not 33 or 31? I don't know, but that's what he said. I'll take his word for it. The author of the book, we are not told who the author is. It could be Mordecai, her older cousin who raised her. Remember, she was an orphan. Can you imagine both mother and father dying? And how she must have cried when they died, but her older cousin raised her. Mordecai, what a godly man he was, man of courage. King Ahasuerus, someone going out said last week they were using the NIV Bible. I think the NIV has Xerxes. Anybody have the NIV in it? Is that correct? Xerxes. So she was saying, he kept saying Ahasuerus. So I took the Pew Bible so I could follow it. 192 times, I believe, that name is found in the book of Esther. That's a lot of times. He was a proud man, the most powerful man on the face of the earth. King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, I believe Ahasuerus would be the Hebrew, Xerxes would be the Greek, and as I said last week, the Persian name I won't even try to pronounce. Starts off with 4 consonants. There's only 3 vowels and about 9 other consonants in the word. No way can I pronounce that. I don't speak that language. But anyway, Esther, a Jew, a woman who was a woman of faith and courage, strength and dignity. The name Esther means star, and certainly she was a star that shone brightly for the Lord. King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I, he was the king of Persia. Haman, he's the evil man who hated the Jews. He hated Mordecai because he would not bow down to him. My wife was watching the movie Esther last night, Esther, and oh boy, he was not happy with Mordecai. He wanted to exterminate the Jews. Queen Vashti, she was the queen, the wife of King Ahasuerus when the book of Esther begins. But in chapter 1 we see the dethroning of Queen Vashti, chapter 1, and then the crowning of Esther will be in chapter 2. The theme of the book of Esther is the providence of God. Remember, we explained what the word providence means. It means to see ahead of time. There's only one person that can see ahead of time, and you know who that is, God. God was able to see ahead of time that Esther would be the new queen, even though she was a Jew. Isn't that interesting how the hand of God was at work, the sovereign hand of God? And the key verse in the book is Esther 4:14. I'm sure you've heard those words before. For such a time as this. God raised her up for such a time as this. The name God does not appear anywhere in the book, but as someone said, he's in the shadows, hiding behind every word, because God's hand is seen throughout the book. The story begins in 483 BC, and Queen Vashti is pregnant with her son Artaxerxes. You remember the name Artaxerxes before? Book of Nehemiah, remember? Cupbearer to the king. 40 years from the time of the writing of this book, at least when it started, Nehemiah, remember, would take some Jews back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah. So Artaxerxes would be the son, and as I said, the name Esther means star. We see in chapter 1, a good way to divide this chapter up is 3 evidences of the king's pride. He was a proud man. We should be humble, shouldn't we? Humility should be a part of every Christian's life, because everything that we are and everything we have is a gift from God. So there's no room for pride. We should be humble. But King Ahasuerus, he was a proud man. And the first evidence we looked at last week, his boastfulness, verses 1 through 9. Today we'd like to look at his drunkenness and anger. And then next week, his revenge. We see 3 banquets in the first 9 verses. Remember, I said last week there are 9 feasts or 9 banquets in the book. They must have liked to eat, right? The Persians like to eat. There are 3 banquets. The first one is for the key military and political officers, and that was a short one, remember? 180 days. Can you imagine a 180-day banquet? 180 days. Anybody have a banquet that lasted that long? No. 180 days. It was a time for them to plan to attack Greece. He was trying to win over the key military and political officers, and he was trying to impress them with his wealth and power. That was the first feast or banquet. The second one was for all. That was 7 days. And then the third banquet was for the women of Shushan, which was presided over by Queen Vashti. But sad to say, God was left out of this banquet. God was not included in this very pagan banquet. And as I said, he was a very boastful man. But we see the providence of God throughout this book, so I would encourage you to keep an eye out for the hand of God as we study this passage. So let's look at this passage again in verses 10, 11, and 12. And the title, A Drunk and Angry King. Look at his pride in verse 10, as it starts off by saying, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was, notice, merry with wine. He was drunk. He had said for the 7-day feast, the 7-day banquet, that you could drink if you wanted to, or you didn't have to drink, but the king, he was drunk. He was drunk. Not a good example to his people. And at the end of this 7-day banquet that King Ahasuerus gave, he was drunk, and he made a base request that his wife, Queen Vashti, would come. He wanted to impress the people with her beauty, so he wanted her to come with her crown and come before these drunken people. She was right to refuse, I believe. She was right. Some Bible teachers are mixed in whether or not she should have come. I don't think there's any way that she should have come. Henrietta Mears said, of course, no Persian woman would have done this. She said Vashti refused, and it made the king a laughingstock. But Henrietta Mears goes on to say, never go against your standards of purity. See, don't do that. Elizabeth Elliot wrote a book, and in that book she said, if your goal in life is purity, then be prepared to be thought of as very odd. That's a good way to be odd, though, in the world, isn't it? Be pure. Queen Vashti refused this request, and actually her response in some ways, I guess you could say, was a triple offense on her part. It was a woman challenging the authority of a man. It was a wife disobeying the orders of her husband. And it was a subject defying the command of the king. And as a result, verse 12 tells us the response of the king. What do you think his response was? That's okay if you don't want to come. No, he was furious. He was angry. But to come unveiled would be scandal enough in a Persian court, and so the queen said no. She would not obey the king's command. Turn with me, if you would, keep your finger in Esther chapter 1. We'll turn over to the right of the book of Psalms, to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32. Proverbs 16, 32. Proverbs chapter 16. Notice the insightful verse that we find here. He who is slow to what? Anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And then over in Proverbs 25, verse 28, book of Proverbs really has some powerful verses that speak to us. Very practical book. Proverbs 25, verse 28. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. King Ahasuerus built a great palace at Susa or Shushan, but he couldn't build his own character, could he? King could not control his temper, and he could not control his drinking either. Let's think about alcohol and anger. Two powerful forces that have brought so much destruction, so much harm to so many people. Now, while the Bible does not command total abstinence, it certainly does emphasize it. You look at, for example, Deuteronomy 29, you see that the nation of Israel did not drink strong drink during their 40 years in the desert as they wandered in the desert. The priests were not to drink wine or strong drink serving in the tabernacle. That's found in Leviticus 10. And then the Nazarites, remember the Nazarite vow. They were forbidden to drink wine, Leviticus chapter 6. Now some people who drink today say, well, Jesus may have drunk wine. After all, he turned water into wine. So they try to make an excuse for their drinking. Well, Warren Wiersbe said people who claim Jesus as their example in social drinking, he said, rarely follow Jesus' example in the other areas of his life. That's probably true, isn't it? If you want to follow that teaching, then follow all the areas of Jesus' life. How about, are you a person of prayer like he was? Do you serve the Lord like he did? Something to keep in mind, isn't it? But I want to emphasize this morning, because I've seen it firsthand in a pastor's home, the wrecked marriages, the ruined bodies and minds, the abused families, and the shattered careers that often accompany people that drink. I remember at Burholm Baptist Church, my dad was there for a number of years there, and I remember I was only a young kid when when my dad was first pastor there, but I remember there was a man who really smelled like alcohol, and he had really struggled with drinking. And I'll never forget that. I was just in elementary school at the time. Longtime baseball coach Connie Mack. Anybody hear that name before? Connie Mack, right? He said alcohol had no more place in the human body than sand in the gas tank of a car. That's true, isn't it? Alcohol destroys lives, destroys families, and it destroys homes. So the Bible does warn us against drunkenness. Too bad King Ahasuerus didn't follow the Bible, right? Kings were not to drink either as well, at least not to be drunk. But King Ahasuerus made a request. Actually, it wasn't really a request, was it? He demanded that his wife, Queen Vashti. So at the 7th day, verse 10 tells us he was drunk. He commanded his servants to bring Queen Vashti into their presence, wearing her royal crown. Now, some believe that she was also expecting, she was pregnant at this time, so she was expecting Artaxerxes to be born soon, and so she was pregnant as well. That would play into this too. And he wanted to impress the people with his wife's beauty. Verse 11. Bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So he wanted to impress them with her beauty. But verse 12 tells us her reaction. And I believe she was right in the reaction that she gave. Verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused. You see that? She refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious. I circle that word, furious. That's his response. He wasn't too happy that his wife refused to do that, the queen. He was furious, and notice it goes on to say that his anger burned within him. He was really upset, wasn't he? Anger. So we talked about drinking, and we also need to talk about anger as well. Oftentimes they go together, don't they? But his anger was only further proof that he was wrong. You know, when you're wrong, sometimes you get angry, don't you? Maybe you know somebody like that. They have a problem with, they have a short fuse, as it goes, as the saying goes. They become angry. The Italian poet wrote to a friend, "Angry men are blind and foolish." It's true. Angry. Now, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Remember that verse? Let's turn there because you might not know that verse. It's an interesting verse. Ephesians 4:26. Notice what the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 4:26. Verse 26 says, "Be ye angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." You see that? Be angry and sin not. So apparently that verse teaches that it's possible to be angry and not to sin. But don't use that as an excuse for your being angry and losing your temper. Well, I'm just following Ephesians 4:26. No, most of the time our anger is not a righteous indignation against sin. We should be upset. We should be angry, a holy anger against sin. That ought to burn in the heart of every godly person, shouldn't it? But most of the time, our anger is not a holy anger against sin. Have you ever thought about what it is that makes you mad? Makes you upset? You ever think about that? Most of the time, it's little things, right? You break your shoelace and you're so mad, or whatever the case might be. It's usually the small things. Sometimes it's the big things. The king didn't get what he wanted. He was used to getting what he wanted, whenever he wanted it, right away. And so he was furious. The queen's response when she said no made him furious. Proverbs 14:17 says, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly. Those are wise words, aren't they? 1 Timothy 2:8 tells us that anger can hinder our praying. Do you know that? It says, lift up holy hands without wrath and anger. Did you ever see that verse before? Lift up holy hands. See, some people, when they pray, they lift their hands up in the air with their palms out like this, waiting for God's answer, right? When you're upset, you normally don't want to pray, do you? I remember our head of the Pastoral Studies Department at Philadelphia College of Bible saying, speaking to the future pastors, me and others, he said, at times in your churches, you're going to have people come at you and they're really going to be mad about something you did. He said, when they do that, he said, sit down with them and say, we're going to have a word of prayer. You start. Because they don't want to pray. So, no, usually when we're upset, we don't want to pray, right? But sometimes people get angry. They're just like a fuse, right, going off. Now this is a good way. John Wesley said that he said, we preachers should get on fire and people will come out and see you burn. That's a good way. Get on fire for God and people will come out and see you burn. That's true. There's preachers like that who you just really enjoy listening to because they preach the word. Robert Murray McCheyne, have you heard that name before? He was a godly man in Scotland. He didn't live to be 30 years old, but I have one of his books at home. He said, live so as to be missed. Wise words. But he gave a gospel tract to Alexander White. Have you heard that name before? Alexander White, powerful preacher. When he was only 7 years old. Alexander White was only 7. A little boy. I used to hand out gospel tracts near Burholm Baptist Church. Ron, remember that there in 5 Points there. Brad and I would go up and down the street, hand out gospel tracts, and we had 3 people that we knew of that got saved through that ministry. He gave a gospel tract to Alexander White. He was only 7 years old at the time. Little did he know that he would go on to become one of the greatest preachers in Scotland. Alexander White said, the sacred writer makes us respect Queen Vashti. Whatever the royal order that came to her out of the banqueting hall exactly was, he said the brave queen refused to obey it. Her beauty was her own. And it was not for open show among hundreds of half-drunk men. Those words are very true, I believe. And because of this, what would happen? Well, what would happen is that Queen Vashti would be dismissed, and she would be banished, and she would be replaced by Queen Esther. See, it's all, God knew what he was doing. It was all in the hand of God. And sometimes maybe you know someone who, they lose their temper. And they say things that they wish they could take back, right? Have you ever done that? Don't raise your hand. But Dr. Bob Cook used to say a speech in anger, and it'll be the finest speech you ever regret. Don't speak when you're angry, right? A woman with a bad temper once told evangelist Billy Sunday, great evangelist, he used to speak so fast. I remember, really, really fast. Billy Sunday. She told him, she said, I have a bad temper, but she said it passes very quickly. It's all over quickly. His reply, so does a shotgun blast. But think about what's left of the week, you see? So maybe you know someone that has a problem with anger. Hopefully it's not you. But we need to make sure that we ask God to help us, because He will, won't He? So I think we have to admire Queen Vashti, who stood by her principles. She refused. She said no. Have you ever heard the verse, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me? Remember those words that Jesus gave? Has that ever confused you? We don't really say it like that. We need to deny ourselves. You know what that means? I heard someone describe it in this way. Really made it understandable to me. To deny yourself means to say no to yourself. I forget, I looked it up, I couldn't find the answer. I do so much reading, I forget who said this. But he said, I make it a practice in my life every single day to say no at least once, just to keep in practice. That's a good thing, isn't it? So Queen Vashti took a stand against the most powerful man in the world at that time. But God's going to work behind the scenes, in the shadows, you might say, to make Esther the queen of Persia. So God can and does move the hearts of people, even rulers in this world, even the most powerful man on the face of the earth at that time. Now, if God is able to do that, and He is, then certainly He's able also to reshape and rechannel our lives, isn't He, if we let Him. Even the lives of those who we may think are unreachable. Have you ever thought that somebody was unreachable? That God could never, ever save that person? Maybe someone's coming into your mind. I remember 40 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long now, about 40 years ago, I asked our church youth group, we had about 50 kids on a Sunday night, and I asked them, if you could save one person, only one, who would that be? And I thought I was going to have answers like, some singer they followed or some famous person. You know what their answers were? My mom, my dad, my brother, my sister. That really stuck with me because I had them hand in those papers. Who do they want to reach? They want to reach their family. And I'm here to say that God can save anybody at all. Because the verse I like to use is a little known verse in Jeremiah 23:29. You remember that verse? Jeremiah 23:29 says this. Is not my word like a fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces? Can God break down a heart that's so hard? I said, yes, He can. And so I got to thinking as I closed, what illustration should I give to close my sermon today to say that God can save anybody? That God can reach someone who maybe has a problem with alcohol or anger or whatever the case might be. So I thought about an example in the Bible, Saul. Remember Saul? I mean, he never got over God's grace. He said he was a chief of sinners. Remember that, 1 Timothy 1? How could he say that? Because remember what he was doing before he was saved? He was hunting down Christians. He was putting them to death. And he never got over how the Lord met him. Remember on the road to Damascus, the light shone from heaven, he was saved. Saul. That's one example I thought of. Then I thought, well, I pulled out some of my books at home and I looked up John Newton. Remember John Newton? Mm-hmm. He wrote Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a what? A wretch like me. He never got over the grace of God either, did he? He was a man who lived a life of sin. He was a slave trader. And that would have been an interesting illustration too to close with, but I picked a different one. Came across this little book. It was hard to find with all my books I have at home. But it's called Set Free. Anybody ever read this book before? Set Free. It was written by Addison Ross. Living proof that no alcoholic needs to despair. You know the name Ross? William Ross founded America's Keswick, Colony of Mercy. America's Keswick that has helped thousands of people overcome the problem of alcohol, drugs, whatever the case might be. But I read this story because God brought it to my mind, and it does remind us that God can save anybody at all. And I'd like you to listen to this as I close my message today, because I think it will encourage your heart. William Ross was a famous artist in England. He used to paint portraits of people. He was a very wealthy man at one time. But it wasn't always that way. Actually, what happened is that he was dying the morning he left the bar, and the person at the bar said, I'm afraid you're a goner, Bill. And so Bill Ross said, I guess I am. He was drunk. He staggered out through the doors of that bar. He was dying on his feet, in his testimony. He struggled back to his studio room in a building which was a block away. He crawled up the steps. Can you picture that? Grown man crawling up the steps of his studio to his studio. His room was full of darkness, he said. The end of his ruined life seemed just ahead. He wasn't even 30 years old, can you imagine? There was no one to help him. He was powerless to help himself. But William Ross had not always been a failure. As a young man, about 20 years of age in England, he was wealthy. He painted famous portraits of people. But unbeknownst to him, his wife was an alcoholic when they got married. He didn't know that. He never touched a drink before that. And alcohol was about to take its toll on William Ross. In his testimony, he said, oh, the misery, the heartaches, the wretched experiences, the ruin of the next 10 years. 10 years is a long time, isn't it? From the age of 20 to the age of 30. He said, I would not, even if I had the space, tell of all of the dreadful life of sin that I lived. He said, we lost some money through a bank failure, then went into business. We neglected that business because of drinking, and it failed again. We mortgaged property, spent the money, sold that property, spent that money, until, listen now, they had lost 14 properties in all. 14. He was really wealthy. He said for months at a time he would never miss a drink. It would start right in the morning. And one night he came home from the bar. He saw the nurse and his wife. They were about to take the little 3-year-old daughter who was sick up to bed. He said, wait a minute. He said, let me take her. He said, Papa will take his darling to bed. He said he insisted upon taking her, so he picked up the pillow with his little 3-year-old daughter on it, and he retraced his unsteady steps to the hall, and when he was halfway up the stairs, he fell, full weight on his daughter, and she died. She died. And he said a few days later he stood at the graveside. Can you imagine this now? He stood at her graveside, weeping. He said he was helpless. He was even drunk then too. He said 2/3 of his money went to drinking, 1/3 for food in the family. He said at last, my brother encouraged, his brother encouraged him to go to the United States of America, thinking that a change in surroundings would enable him to stop drinking. So he went to the United States, but within 2 or 3 days he was already drinking again. And over the next 2 years, he said he lived an up and down life, but mostly down, until it was all down. Then he said he was walking down the street, he was depressed, and he pulled from his pocket 3 copper pennies. That's all the money he had left. 3 pennies. He looked across the street and there was a fruit stand. He bought an apple with the last 3 pennies that he had. How much are apples today? I'm sure that was a long time ago. But anyway, he had no money now. He said it was the last of his money thanks to alcohol and sin. He said at times he would spin a loaded revolver around on his finger, wishing the thing would go off and thus end his unbearable existence. Sad, isn't it? But what happened in his studio, as I started my illustration, he was in his studio and he thought back to his mother's God. He got down on his knees in front of the easel where he painted so many famous portraits. And he cried out to God to save him. His mother used to write him letters and say, "Son, if you would only turn to Jesus Christ just as you are, he would take away your sin and he'd set you free." He said without a friend in the world, he got down on his knees and he cried out to God. He heard my cry, he said, and he saved me. He stayed on his knees for about 2 or 3 hours, just to make sure it was genuine. And then he went on to, as the story goes in this book, he bought the bar where he used to drink, turned it into a rescue mission, and then he felt led, according to a verse, Jeremiah 9, "Oh, that I had in the wilderness a lodging place of wayfaring men." He wanted to find a place that he could get out in the country to help people like him who had a problem with alcohol. And so he's with, listen, $1.87 is all he had, and a trunk full of canned goods. They bought that property in Whiting, New Jersey. 7 men from the Whosoever Mission in Germantown, Pennsylvania, were there with him, and they founded that Keswick Colony of Mercy. He was set free. It's amazing what God can do, isn't it? God can save anybody. Do not ever give up on anyone. Saul, John Newton, William Ross, you can add to the list. People hurt, people who drink or have a terrible temper or anger, but God can change a heart. It's got our hands and our hearts together in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we think about King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, a man who was so proud, who was not a good example to his people, he was drunk, who had a problem with his anger. We all know people like that. People in this world without God, who are helpless and hopeless without God. But we're reminded that God can save anybody. He can break down even a heart of stone, make it soft, so people can be saved. So we have a God of miracles, don't we? A God of might and miracles. Maybe you come here today, your life's been affected by someone who has hurt you, Or maybe it's you, your life that has been affected by alcohol or anger. You say, Pastor Brooks, will you please pray for me? I'm hurting here this morning. Anyone at all this morning say, Pastor Brooks, will you pray for me? Thank you for that hand. Anyone else? Thank you for that hand. Thank you for those hands. Anyone else? Very quickly, put your hand up, put it down. Dear Heavenly Father, many people in this world struggle with alcohol or drugs or smoking or any other sin. We can't withstand those sins without your help. Thank you for the power and the strength that you give us to live our lives. May we cry out to you just like William Ross did to save us and to give us your power. May we never ever give up on anybody because God is able. We ask these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.